my plan for these 5 weeks then, or these 5 sessions, is to look at one gospel each week for the first 4, and then to spend the last week talking a little bit more about art, talking a little bit more about ways other New Testament writings talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, to talk about ways in which we might kind of sum things up. And so tonight I want to start off by looking at the gospel according to Mark. I chose to start with Mark instead of Matthew simply because biblical scholars think that Mark was probably the first of the 4 to have been written. That doesn't make it better or worse necessarily, or more or less accurate. It's just, as far as we can tell, the first time somebody set down onto paper or papyrus the story of Jesus' death. Others might have before Mark, but we don't have surviving copies of at least the whole story. There are other early New Testament, early gospel writings, early Christian writings that talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, but nothing as comprehensive as what we see in Mark, and then next week Matthew, and then Luke, and then John. So each week I also want to focus on a historical detail that I think is really important for unpacking these stories, for knowing a little bit more about the first century setting in which Jesus lived, and the what's the word I want? I guess the social system in which he was put to death, so that we have a better understanding of what it meant for Jesus to have been crucified in his day and age. And tonight I want to begin simply with the observation, or with the reality that that he was crucified, which might sound obvious, but this is it's a really important kind of way into understanding Jesus, is to begin not so much with his birth, but really with his death. All but the most cynical or skeptical of historians believe that somebody named Jesus of Nazareth actually lived and gathered a following, and was probably executed at the end of his life. And the reason that most believe that is because some of the details look rather ordinary. We know that the Romans crucified a lot of people within the Roman Empire. We know that the Romans in Judea, which is where Jerusalem is located, Jesus does most of his work in Galilee to the north. His life ends in Judea. The way the Gospels describe his death sounds very familiar based on what we know from other ancient literature about how the Romans ran their empire. And so the fact that he died by crucifixion also tells us that his death was probably caused by the Romans, that Roman officials would have had to have decreed this, would have had to be the ones who carried it out and who approved it. We know from other ancient writings and the way in which they talk about crucifixion that crucifixion had a purpose from the perspective of the Roman power, other than just ending somebody's life. It also meant to send a message. Crucifixion tended to be reserved for people who were considered to be enemies of the state, or for excessively violent criminals, or for people who were slaves or otherwise of very low social status. Jesus was not crucified alongside two common criminals or two like petty thieves. The people he's crucified with were probably considered insurrectionists or somehow very violent in their own right. So when we talk about Jesus dying on a cross, or when Christian churches deploy the cross as their main symbol for talking about Christian faith, one of the things that we're acknowledging is that Jesus was, again, deemed by the powers that be to be dangerous. For the Romans to have chosen crucifixion as the means of ending his life, in contrast to any other ways the Romans might have wanted to kill somebody who was in their custody, suggests that they see Jesus as more than just a nuisance, that they see him as at least speaking threatening language. Whether or not he thought his followers were large enough to actually constitute a real threat is another question. But they see something about him and about his teaching and about his ministry and about his followers as being subversive, if not openly seditious or rebellious. Rome simply didn't tolerate people within its borders talking about other kings or other kingdoms, the ways in which the Gospels describe Jesus, talking about what he's come to announce. All four Gospels speak of a sign hung over Jesus that says the King of the Jews, or some variation on that phrase. That detail in the Gospels suggests that in crucifying Jesus, the Romans were, among other things, trying to respond to the notion that there could be some kind of liberation for Jews in their time, that there was a hope for a return to a Jewish state, or there was a hope for a return to the land of Israel. And so by crucifying Jesus, they're not just getting rid of him, they're also trying to discredit this idea of, again, of hope for freedom from Rome. And so Christian theology throughout the years has tended to look at Jesus' crucifixion as important, not just in terms of talking about a painful death or a horrific death or a death of alienation, but also a statement about the ways in which Jesus and his ministry attracted the opposition of the most powerful people in his region. That something about what Jesus was saying and doing was deemed to be not just offensive, but downright dangerous to those who controlled the levers of power in his day. And so to begin with the crucifixion, or to take the crucifixion seriously, in many ways then forces us to go back into the rest of the Gospels and say, what is it about this person that would have been so offensive? What is it about Jesus that would have gotten the attention of the rulers, that would have made them want to expend the effort to kill him in such a way, to make a statement out of him? And so again, I guess tonight, one of the things that I want to hold up at the very beginning here is simply to say this, that the manner of Jesus' death, right, the fact that he dies by crucifixion, it matters for understanding the meaning of his death. Our theology, or our way of understanding Christian faith or understanding Jesus, might be very different if Jesus had been, strangled in a prison cell or killed in some other way. But his death appears to have been very public as well as very violent. And again, meant to send a message. So I want to share my screen and look at some imagery, but also a couple of quotes to help unpack that a little bit more. And then we'll dig into Mark's gospel. Hopefully you all can see this, or if not, you can maybe rearrange the images on the side of your screen to help you see all of it. I've tried to keep things on like the left half of the screen here. But in talking about crucifixion, what that meant in the ancient world, like I said, this was a manner of death, a manner of capital punishment that the Romans reserved for certain people. A nice way to sum up what it meant comes from a book by Fleming Rutledge, who's a longtime Episcopal priest and preacher, and her book, The Crucifixion, has this to say about how crucifixion was viewed in the ancient world, or how the Romans used it. Crucifixion had as its express purpose the elimination of victims from consideration as members of the human race. It was meant to indicate to all who might be toying with subversive ideas that crucified persons were not of the same species as either the executioners or the spectators, and were therefore not only expendable, but also deserving of ritualized extermination. In other words, the ways in which the Romans would crucify people in public, elevated, at crossroads, on hilltops, usually stripping the victims naked, exposing them to the elements, exposing them to shame, as well as a long, slow, painful process of dying, appears to be a way in which the Romans, again, were trying to discredit people. We're trying to strip people of their dignity, trying to strip them of their humanity as well. It makes sense that in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus' followers all flee, that they all run away. This would have been not just the loss of their friend or the loss of their leader, but it would have also been the discrediting or the degradation of everything that they had hoped for or believed in. Another good example of thinking about crucifixion comes from a book by James Cone, a longtime African-American professor, theologian. I preached at Westminster back in August, I think, and used a long quote from James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And one of the key pieces of this book is Cone says, if you want to understand what crucifixion looked like or how it functioned during the Roman Empire, you might want to look at the history of lynching in the United States as a kind of example or a kind of analogy to what that looked like. Lynching was, of course, lethal. It was also very public. It also had the purpose of, beyond killing a victim, also shaming that person, also sending a message to others about what kind of behavior was not going to be tolerated. Cone points out that if you were to have been lynched in the United States from the late 19th century till the mid to late 20th century, chances are you were Black. Just like in the Roman world, if you were to be crucified, chances are you were a slave, or chances are you were perceived as being somebody subversive to the state. Of the 4,743 lynchings that are recorded, the people we know about in the United States during roughly a 100-year period, 72% of the victims were Black, and many of the white victims were lynched because they were perceived as helping Blacks in the civil rights struggle as well. So Cone points up the way in which lynching served to terrorize African-American communities in the United States for a long time. And it was a kind of death that was reserved in many ways for certain kinds of people who committed certain kinds of crimes. And Cone says there's something about that that sounds a lot like crucifixion in the ancient world. This would have made the Christian faith hard to talk about if indeed the leader had been killed by crucifixion, right? How do you overcome that stigma? How do you overcome that shame? The Gospels, of course, or as we'll see, of course, simply just describe it. They jump right in to describing Jesus as being crucified. And one of the terms that often gets used to talk about this part of the gospel stories, all four Gospels describe Jesus dying, is this term, the Passion, a term it's been around for a long time. Some people know it because of the title of Mel Gibson's horrifically graphic film of about maybe 15 years ago. The term the Passion in English isn't about passion in the sense of deep emotion. It just simply comes from the Greek word, the verb pasco, which means to suffer, a verb or a word that also passed into Latin, passio, meaning suffering. So when people talk about the passion of Jesus, what they're talking about is his suffering. The part of the story that runs pretty much from his arrest until his burial. His arrest, being taken by night in secrecy, being arrested, then being tried either in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning, of being tortured, of being beaten and mocked, of being judged guilty of death, and then being publicly paraded to his place of crucifixion, and finally being killed there. That whole part of the story is often referred to as the Passion. So if I use that expression, that's what I'm talking about. So I want to then take us into the Gospel of Mark, but maybe first I should take a quick break here and make sure I haven't lost anybody, or if there's any questions, just to kind of set crucifixion into that ancient context, so that we understand this is not necessarily a death just like any other death. Anything I need to pick up? Anything I said that was confusing or deserving of more attention, or just plain wrong, perhaps? So I see Dwayne Cronky waving at me. If you can unmute, Dwayne, I've got you. Dwayne, I can't hear you. I don't know if you can unmute your microphone.
Did Rome have a law, a statute prescribing what was necessary to submit someone to crucifixion, or was it just on the whim of whoever was conducting some sort of trial?
Yeah, I don't know about in later years, but at this point in the first century, there's no like formal statute that said, only these people qualify for crucifixion. The Roman Empire is still a very young empire during the time of Jesus, and it hasn't really like codified its laws yet. It's pretty much whatever the local officials deem is necessary is what they can get away with. So someone like Pontius Pilate, who's the governor of Judea, is essentially the representative of the emperor, and he can do about whatever he thinks he needs to do in order to preserve peace. He also has to preserve a sense of Roman privilege. Roman society is very, very stratified, with the elites and their rights or their privileges, and other groups and down the ladder. So if you were, say, a Roman citizen in the Roman Empire and had done something horrific, chances are you would either be exiled, or if you were to be killed, it probably would not be through crucifixion. It was just kind of more like, this is the way things are. Roman authors who talk about it tend to speak about crucifixion in real kind of roundabout ways. They don't want to talk about it directly because it's considered to be such an abhorrent thing that nobody in polite company would ever want to discuss it. Right? This is the stuff that's reserved really for the lowest of the low. And that's not so much by statute, that's just kind of by custom, as best we can tell.
So there was no system to appeal to the Supreme Court in Rome saying, this ain't right.
Correct, especially for somebody like Jesus, who's probably perceived as kind of an unwashed peasant from the north, has no real cultural currency. When you look at other parts of the New Testament that talk about, say, the Apostle Paul, for example, who appears to be multilingual, who appears to be, who has a trade, who appears to be pretty well off, who might even be a Roman citizen, he seems to have a lot, when he gets arrested, he seems to have a lot more legal tricks up his sleeve in terms of making appeals and being able to defend himself. And that's probably just because he has more kind of social status than somebody like Jesus would have had. Yeah, the other Dwayne, looking Bill.
Yeah, I'm the second Dwayne.
Okay.
Well, I'm wondering, how serious do you take ought we take the crucifixion as a political reality, as a political act in reality, a claim of truth against truth? Jesus was the king, and there's kind of the mocking of that. But I think political, not only from the Roman side of formation, but from the Jewish side of formation, and the understanding of God in the midst of this, which I'm sure we will get to. I'm not asking you to answer that. The whole presentation is going to answer that. But how seriously to take it, so that we see it sort of has a transcendence to its time that sort of reaches across history into the present.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping I'm going to get to in these 5 weeks. I mean, I hope we get to that question, because it's a big question, right? How is this about more than just the death of a man 2,000 years ago? How does this story become timeless, or what does it tell us about ourselves? So I do want to make sure we get to that. I think with regard to Jesus, and we'll see this, that some of the Gospels tell the story kind of on the ground, in the sense of, you see it taking place as a political drama of a guy who offends the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they unleash a system that's determined to crush him, and indeed it does. I mean, you can kind of see that playing itself out. And I think Mark's perspective is very much like that. When we get to like John's gospel, but also in Luke's gospel, we're given more glimpses into a kind of spiritual purpose taking place, perhaps. And that's maybe a different perspective, right? Mark's maybe saying this is what it looked like on the ground. John's gospel is, almost viewing into heaven and getting a sense of a deeper narrative taking place, like a 2-level narrative taking place. So I think that's part of it. I think at one level, it very much is a political act. I mean, this is, Pilate is he's the highest ranking Roman in the region. The chief priests, who the Gospels describe as collaborating with Pilate, we'll talk about them a lot more next week. They aren't just religious functionaries, they also have a political role in keeping the peace in Jerusalem. They're essentially the local leaders who are charged with, maintenance of the social order. So for Jesus to be executed, suggests there's some kind of political expediency or some kind of political purpose at play in all of this. I don't know if that gets at your question. And then one more I see in the chat. If Jesus had stayed in Galilee, would the Romans have come out to arrest him, or they've been? That's a really good question. When Jesus is in Galilee, he probably is able to keep a pretty low profile, in the sense of the people with a lot of political power probably aren't noticing him. But coming to Jerusalem when he does, which is around, all the Gospels place that around Passover, when the city is more of a tinderbox, when the city is way more populated than it usually is, and to show up in Jerusalem in kind of the heart of Jewish cultural identity, and to be making claims about the kingdom of God, and perhaps to be disrupting trade in the temple, things like that, probably seal his fate in ways that might not have happened in Galilee. All right, good questions. Yeah, Dwayne, one more.
It's, if we just stop here and sort of put to one side the whole story of the resurrection, I can see in our time other, in fact, religious leaders who, I think especially of Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was assassinated in March of 1980 because he was protesting every Sunday in his homily the latest abuses and of the regime, the army, and everything else. And they didn't like that, of course, and they killed him.
Right. Killed him while he was celebrating Mass, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Right. There's a way in which there's something timeless about the crucifixion of Jesus, I think, right? Where we see other religious martyrs, and there's something, which is one thing I want to lift up, I think, through all 5 weeks. On the one hand, of course, as Christians, we understand this as a particular or a special or a significant event on its own, but there's also something, like I said, very ordinary about it, right? From the Roman perspective, or from the perspective of most onlookers at the time, this would have looked like, from the perspective of Good Friday, one more death, right, of one more poor guy who ended up on the wrong side of Roman power, and whose life was treated as expendable, right? That there's something so almost ordinary about it, which is also significant to note. All right, I want to dig into Mark's gospel, and these passion narratives that we have in all 4 gospels are too long to walk through and hit every single detail and to put up on the screen. So I'm going to try to summarize them for you. If you had a chance to read it in advance, great. If not, and you have a Bible in front of you, start at Mark chapter 14, verse 32, where basically what we get is Jesus going to Gethsemane. This is the Mount of Olives. This is just on the border of Jerusalem. Jesus goes there at night to pray. That's where he's arrested. Mark describes everybody abandoning Jesus and fleeing. Jesus is then taken to the council of the high priest. There's one high priest and many chief priests. So kind of imagine the high priest as the top dog, so to speak, and then has a council of other chief priests who are with him. And Jesus, in the middle of the night, is questioned by them. He's interrogated by them. He says, "I am," when they ask him if he's the Son of the Blessed One. And then he speaks about coming again with power on the clouds of heaven. The priest tears his clothing and accuses him of blasphemy, and they all say he deserves to die. In 1466, Peter denies Jesus. So Peter, his closest follower, who at the Last Supper said, no matter what, I will never forsake you. And Jesus says, guess what? Before morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. And of course, that plays itself out. In chapter 15, early in the morning, the chief priests bring Jesus before Pontius Pilate. This is the Roman governor who is in town, not because he lives in Jerusalem. He's come to Jerusalem because it's Passover season. Major Jewish festival, celebrating what? The deliverance from foreign oppressors, deliverance out of Egypt in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. So Pilate knows what's up. He knows enough about Judaism to know that he should be in town with some soldiers for this holiday. They bring Jesus before Pilate. Jesus refuses to really engage him in conversation. Pilate hands over another criminal, a man named Barabbas, and then sends Jesus off to his crucifixion. Soldiers mock Jesus. Somebody has to carry his cross for him. A man named Simon of Cyrene is compelled to carry the cross for Jesus. And by 9 in the morning, he's being crucified. The previous night, Passover began at sundown, major Jewish festival. By 9 the next morning, Jesus is already on the cross, crucified with 2 other people. Everybody mocks him, and then Mark says that he dies at 3 in the afternoon after saying only one thing in Mark's gospel. The only thing Jesus says from the cross is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then we're told that some of his followers, a group of women, are watching from a distance, and then Jesus is buried at the end of chapter 15. Sorry to run so quickly through that, but we'll have a chance to look in more detail as well when we look at Matthew and Luke and John in coming weeks. But that's the basic story as Mark tells it. What I want to do is to highlight just a couple of details about the story for our attention, just to kind of give you a sense of what does Mark seem to think is important for us to know. I'm just going to point out really quickly, for the most part, Mark's gospel is more of a showing gospel than a telling gospel. In other words, Mark doesn't give us a whole lot of explanation about anything. Mark just describes the story and kind of wants to usher us into the scene and be observers more than understanders, perhaps. And so the gospel has very little comment on the meaning of Jesus' death or the purpose of Jesus' death. It's more interested simply in just describing it and having us experience the event. We have to consider the historical setting. In some ways, I just did that, talking about how this is what crucifixion meant in the ancient world. And we also have to look for cues and emphases in Mark's story. In other words, we're not going to find, a verse or 5 verses that says, this is why Jesus is crucified and this is why it's important. Mark would rather just tell us the story and invite us into asking the question, well, what do you experience? What do you see taking place? So in many ways for Mark, this is the climax of the whole gospel. Obviously, Jesus does a lot of things in the Gospel of Mark, but the story of his death really is the focus or the climax of the plot, if I can use those terms to describe Mark. In the very beginning, as early as chapter 3, verse 6, people want to kill Jesus. It doesn't take him long to make enemies in this gospel. When he starts talking about his future in the middle of Mark's gospel, chapters 8, 9, and 10, if you heard Brian Blunt's sermon at Westminster 2 Sundays ago, he talked a bit about this around the transfiguration, that Jesus starts talking about his death in the middle of the story and saying, this is what's going to happen to me in Jerusalem. He makes statements about Jerusalem in chapter 11 and chapter 13. He's predicting hard times to come. Once he's actually in the city, Mark's a very fast-paced gospel. It's hard to tell how much time is transpiring because Mark just kind of likes to jump from one scene to the next. When Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, however, the pace of the story slows down quite a bit, perhaps drawing attention to the importance of this part of the story. As well, Mark understands, I think, that crucifixion is an attention-getting thing. In the ancient world, to talk about somebody being crucified is going to get their attention, especially if you're trying to start a movement or if you're trying to describe the leader of your movement. The crucifixion has the potential to disqualify everything. In other words, the fact that Jesus dies on a cross gives people all sorts of reasons not to care, not to listen, or to be even turned off perhaps by this movement. So Mark, in many ways, by describing the crucifixion without trying to sugarcoat it, I think is pulling people into it, wants to pull us into the horror of the event. At the same time, Mark's going to have these statements about things like fulfillment and purpose that get woven into the Passion narrative. For example, when Jesus dies in Mark, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's quoting the opening verse of Psalm 22, which is curious. That's just, he's quoting scripture as he dies. Other places in Mark's story describes people the soldiers dividing Jesus' clothing, right? They strip him naked to crucify him, and then they take his stuff, right? And they have to figure out who gets what. Well, there's a reference to that in Psalm 22. So it's as if Mark's gospel is telling the story in a way that almost echoes this psalm, right? Saying that the story that's being told here might be familiar to Jews who have been reading their Bible. When it comes to the passion story itself, I want to just call attention to three different dimensions of this. Who are the participants, right? Who does Mark point us to? Who are the people who are participating in the story? What aspects of the story describe tragedy or disappointment or failure? And then third, where is Mark showing us something being revealed or something being disclosed through the crucifixion of Jesus? Mark certainly sees this as a desolate scene, as a disappointing scene, as a horrific scene. But Mark also, I think, wants to direct our attention to something new becoming visible in the crucifixion of Jesus. So those three things, right? I'm going to kind of run through these again. If you're newer to Mark's gospel, you might want to go back and double check me on this later tonight or through the week. I hope I don't go too quickly, but we can slow down and talk about some of these as well if we want. Who are the participants? Like, who takes place in this? One of the things that's interesting about Mark is once Jesus is arrested, there are no more disciples near him or no friendly faces at the cross. Peter is close, but then Peter denies him 3 times. When Jesus is crucified, there's no mention of anybody who is an ally, who is anywhere near him. Not until after he dies, and then Mark tells us about a group of women who watched from a distance. So abandonment is a big part of Mark's way of telling the story. Mark also describes certain Jews who are part of the temple establishment. These are not your run-of-the-mill folks. These are really the upper crust of Jerusalem society. Again, the high priest, this is the highest kind of religious official in the Roman world. He's also somebody who has a kind of cooperative relationship with the Romans, right? To stay in power, to remain high priest, he has to collaborate with the Roman leadership. The chief priests are similar. These are people who come from certain priestly families in Jerusalem. They, as best we can tell, they tend to be pretty wealthy. They tend to have, they kind of married within their own circles. Their children married, their friends' children. We also have scribes and elders who are also kind of temple functionaries. These are, again, a pretty narrow slice of Jerusalem society. We have, of course, Pontius Pilate, who, like I said, is the most powerful Roman in this part of the world. He essentially carries all of the emperor's authority with himself. He can do almost anything he wants as governor. He can't be so violent or so repulsive that people rise up against him, however, because that's bad for business from the Romans' perspective. Mark tells us about 2 bandits who are crucified alongside Jesus. That term bandit doesn't get used often in English these days. I always think of like movies about train robbers in the Old West when I hear bandit, or people who rob banks, with bandanas over their faces. But these are people who probably were engaged in some kind of criminal activity that was meant to undercut the Roman society. We know from other writings that term that gets translated bandit describes some people who used to attack Roman food caravans, things like that, which try to destabilize Roman rule in the region. There are mockers in this story. There are soldiers who dress Jesus up as a king and mock him. There are people who walk by when he's being crucified and taunt him. It's not a pretty scene at all. There are Roman soldiers, of course, who carry out the crucifixion. There's also a centurion who's the leader of the Roman soldiers, what we might call an officer. In this really odd moment after Jesus dies, Mark tells us that the temple curtain, or a curtain in the Jerusalem temple, is torn from top to bottom. And then also the Roman centurion who's there at the cross says, truly this man was the Son of God, or was a son of God. So it's this really inexplicable confession of recognition from maybe the last person on the scene you would expect to care, or the last person you'd expect to have any kind of insight into what's going on. So we'll come back to that. And then Mark also tells us this. This is after Jesus has died. Mark says, there were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. So, and then there's more in verse 41. Mark says that these women were with him all throughout his ministry in Galilee. It's an odd thing for the gospel author to do. We've had no reference throughout all 15 chapters to women being part of kind of the company of Jesus followers. And it's at this point in the story where Mark says, oh yeah, by the way, there were more than just the 12 disciples, essentially, the 12 male disciples. There was also a group of women. He names 3 of them for us. And then he also says, and even though Jesus, appears to be abandoned, well, looking on from a distance at least, were some disciples, these 3 women, among others, who at least followed close to the cross, if not all the way to the foot of the cross. In chapter 16, Mark will name these 3 women as well as the ones who go to the tomb on Easter morning as well. So these are the participants, right? I mean, I started off saying there's no disciples, no friendly faces, but then after the death, Mark says, well, there were some, and they were close by. But Mark makes us walk through or read through the crucifixion scene, viewing Jesus very much alone. Elements of tragedy. What makes Mark's account so tragic, other than the sheer fact that somebody dies by crucifixion, of course? When it comes to the trial, Mark describes the trial, or the questioning, the interrogation in front of the Jewish leadership, as really kind of a joke. Mark introduces the scene. This is in chapter 14, verse 53. Mark introduces the scene as the council was looking for a reason to put Jesus to death. They just had to find a reason. They already knew what they wanted to do. Mark also describes false witnesses coming forward, but the false witnesses can't keep their stories straight. Their testimonies don't agree, which is almost, if the stakes weren't so high, would be humorous. They're unable to carry their plan out. They're unable to get the false witnesses to do what they need to do. This all happens under cover of darkness. Again, remember, this is Passover. This is one of the biggest celebrations in the Jewish calendar. It's in the middle of the night. This is happening probably in a room with not a lot of people present. They're looking for an excuse to get Jesus handed over to the Romans. For Jesus' part, he's pretty disengaged, or he's passive. He's not interested in answering their questions. He doesn't seem to speak at all until he's asked a very direct question. When he goes before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, as well, he's very elusive. He doesn't give straight answers to his questions. It's not clear, does Jesus not want to engage? Is Jesus frightened? Is he somehow defiant? It's not exactly clear what makes him so passive. Perhaps he knows already how the story is going to end. There's rejection all around. His followers flee him. The Jewish leadership denounces him. Pilate doesn't want to go to bat for him. There's the soldiers torture him. The soldiers mock him. There's just an aspect of burlesque to the whole thing. They blindfold him and then hit him and say, if you're a prophet, tell us who hit you. They put a crown on his head made out of thorns to kind of worship him as a mock king. He's abandoned by his closest friends. He's denied by Peter. However, the women don't fully abandon him, right? Mark holds out this one little bit of hope that there are still faithful disciples. And Mark also might make us wonder, is he also abandoned by God? That line that he speaks, my God, why have you forsaken me, is one that's haunting. It kind of messes with our minds if we want to approach this from a Trinitarian perspective, understanding Jesus himself as being God. Somehow what Jesus experiences in that dying moment is not just abandonment by those who are close to him, but he experiences a kind of divine abandonment, right? Or a kind of betrayal by God, which I don't know if I can explain. I can just acknowledge that it sounds haunting for anybody to ever feel that way or to experience that. So I would say, and again, this is me skipping over a lot of material and offering a conclusion here, which we can talk about, but that all told, Mark's portrayal of Jesus' execution is really an ugly scene. We might call it an unmitigated tragedy from the perspective of Good Friday. Remember, there is no Easter story yet. That comes in chapter 16. But for those who might have viewed this, again, this just looks like the death of somebody who dies after 6 hours of crucifixion, who dies accusing God, who dies alone, who dies ashamed. Except we get things like the tearing of the curtain in the temple, and we get things like the centurion's confession. That line in Psalm 22, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? It's the only thing he says in Mark's gospel once he's been crucified. It's the only thing he says in Matthew's gospel. So we'll have a chance to dig into that a little bit more next week as well. But part of the experience of crucifixion for Jesus goes beyond simply physical pain. Interesting, Mark doesn't even describe that. The way Mark describes the crucifixion is very brief. Mark says simply, and they crucified him. The gospel assumes that readers know what that means, what that looks like, the violence involved in it. Mark doesn't spend a lot of time. This is opposite to something like Mel Gibson's movie, for example, which spends a lot of time focusing on the gore and the raw pain. Mark just simply names it. It was crucifixion. And Mark draws way more attention, I think, to the idea of Jesus abandoned. Jesus is somebody who's left to die alone, again, by his friends, but also in his experience in some way by God. We'll come back to that as well. The third thing I wanted to point out, remember again, this cast of characters, trying to get a sense of the variety of people who participate in the story. The second one was the disappointment or the tragedy in the way in which Mark tells the story. There's nothing here that looks like a victory from Mark's point of view, I don't think. But Mark does give us some revealing. There's something that happens in this story that Mark wants us to notice as well. For Mark, the Passion story is the time of disclosure. What do I mean by that? In Mark's gospel, Jesus does not want people to know who he is most of the time. He tells people to keep it quiet. When it comes time for the crucifixion, though, he's crucified with the words King of the Jews over his head. In his trial, he's asked point blank, are you the Son of the Blessed One? Are you the Son of God? And he says, I am. He gives an unambiguous answer. This is the first time in Mark's gospel that Jesus gives clear indications of exactly who he is. And what's maybe notable about that is for Mark, we see this at the time when it's too late, or when it's too late for him to display power, perhaps. Mark depicts the crucifixion of Jesus as almost like a coronation. There's a procession involved. He's dressed as a king. The sign, King of the Jews, is attached to the cross with him. They offer him wine to drink, which was something that a king would do in a coronation ritual in some ancient societies as well. So here are the aspects of disclosure. He openly asserts his identity before the high priest. He dies as King of the Jews. The irony then is we finally see Jesus as the Messiah and as the King at the moment when he looks the most powerless and most pathetic. In other words, he doesn't fit expectations. If people were expecting Messiah to come in and exercise a lot of power, or to overthrow society and to institute a new one, or to come in and rule in the place of Pilate or anybody else, they don't get that. And it's as if Mark wants us to not pass over the cross too quickly, but to recognize that in the cross, in this moment of powerlessness, is when you actually understand what it means for Jesus to be King and Messiah. And so there's an aspect of irony there. I'm a big fan of irony. This is maybe my favorite example of irony, when things aren't exactly what they appear to be, right? Or the truth of something is contrary to what it seems to be saying. And so I think irony for Mark is that the King of the Jews is one who dies on a cross, that the Messiah is one who dies on a cross, that Jesus' death, from the perspective of Mark, isn't a failure or isn't a diversion from what he was supposed to do. This is how God intends to change the world, right? Through becoming subject to some of the worst things that humanity can dish out. Mark also wants us to know that the curtain in the temple has been torn in half from top to bottom. This is the part of the temple that separates where God was presumed to dwell in the temple and where the priests would do their work. There's no longer a division, so to speak, between the holy part of the temple and the more common part of the temple. When Jesus was baptized in Mark's gospel, the very beginning in Mark chapter 1, when he comes up out of the water, he sees the heavens torn apart and the Holy Spirit descends into him like a dove. It's that there's a recall of that verb of tearing, right? Where the heavens were torn apart, God comes into the human arena, so to speak, in the baptism of Jesus. And then in Jesus' death, something gets altered in the temple as well. And then they have the centurion. I mentioned him earlier, right? Who in the world is this person? And how does an outsider like him, how does the Roman soldier who oversaw the crucifixion have some kind of keen perception? How is he able to recognize something glorious about Jesus when Jesus dies a rather pathetic death, right? As somebody who's been nailed to a cross as a criminal. That's a lot of material. I'm going to pause there and just ask you to, well, if there's any questions I can answer or things that I've skipped over that you think deserve some attention, we'll come back to some of these details in the question and answer time or the discussion time as well. I want you to note some of these details, and some of the particularity will come out in more relief, I think, when we also look at Matthew, when we also look at Luke, when we also look at John. But Karen, were you signaling to me?
Yeah. So if so much was done in the behind the scenes or in the dark or just a few people, then how is it that Mark knows all these details?
That's a great question. Yeah, how is it that any gospel author knows the details? When it comes to the trial of Jesus or the interrogation of Jesus, all four gospels describe it. But it's one of the stories that all four gospels tell. But what's also notable is the four gospels also differ quite a bit in how they describe it in terms of the dialogue that they report, which suggests that nobody's exactly sure exactly what was said in those interrogations, that the gospel authors are perhaps either going by hearsay or they're imagining what it probably was like or something like that. So Mark, it's very brief. In Matthew, there's a little bit more dialogue, for example. In Luke, there's less dialogue, but there's more hearings take place. And in John, there's a lot more. Jesus has much more conversation with Pilate, for example. So from a historical perspective, do we know exactly what the nature of those interrogations was like? I think we have to say no, if the goal is to figure out exactly what words were being said. But the Gospels do all suggest that a couple of things. I think some common themes emerge. One is they're pretty determined to do away with him no matter what he says or does. And Jesus himself is really not interested in pleading for his life. What's not clear, because the gospel doesn't give us vocal cues, right? It doesn't say like, read this sarcastically, or read this defiantly. What we don't know is when he says things like, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power. Is he saying that defiantly? Or is he saying this in more of a coward voice? COWERED, kind of a trembling voice. We just don't know. But they all seem to suggest that he's being not fairly tried as much as he's being kind of processed by a system. Does that help in that regard? Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible somebody witnessed this and went and told people, and there were stories circulating, but the fact that the Gospels aren't exactly the same makes it difficult to be certain. Somebody else, David.
I saw the, the sort of a pathetic end to the crucifixion, but really, he was being human. If he was totally human and totally divine, he was just being totally human there with his death. So is that a Presbyterian?
I don't think it's necessarily a Presbyterian thing. I think it's a human thing. I think I'll tip the hand a little bit. When we look at John's gospel, Jesus' last words in John are, "It is finished." And then it says that he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. I mean, in John, it's as if he decides it's time to die. He has a lot of agency or a lot of power in his own death. In Mark, he looks in some ways more like a victim who's screaming in agony and then dies. I'm not so sure that, I mean, you could say that Mark looks more human than John. I think that's true. It's one reason why I like Mark's story. Mark's way of telling the story is because it just rings true to me somehow, which is probably because if this happened to me, that's how I would go out. I would not go out calmly and trusting God in my dying breath, I think, as much as I would be terrified and in agony. You know, I mean, there's something about the way Mark tells it that makes us say, this is horrible, but also, yes, he's very much one of us, and he experiences not just an unimaginable amount of physical pain, but he imagines a kind of psychological anguish that's difficult to even imagine, I think. At least that's how I read it, or that's how I hear it. And to me, that's what makes me uncomfortable, because these aren't things I like to think about on a otherwise lovely Monday evening. But it does call me into the question of what could possibly be good about this scene, right? What could possibly be positive about this, if anything? Maybe I just answered your question with a question there, Jill. I'm not sure, but.
Hey, Matt, it's Barbara.
Yeah. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Sorry, I've got like 25 boxes here trying to find you. Okay.
I know it's, well, one thing I was just thinking in terms of, him saying, my God, why have you forsaken me, is that, sin can't really, as I understand it, exist in within God. And that at the point in time where Jesus takes on fully the sin of man, that there is that separation between he and the Father, until he's dead. I don't know. Sarah, have you heard anything along that line?
That has been proposed. That's one of the ways some people have read this throughout history, is to say that, yes, at this moment, Jesus is now bearing sin. And so some kind of change in his being takes place where God withdraws, so to speak, and now he dies fully as a human. Most theologians, again, who like to nitpick over things like this, have said that doesn't seem to quite work. That for Jesus and to what would that mean for Jesus' own essence to change in that moment? Seems problematic or difficult to figure out what that would even look like, or what. At the same time, what does it mean to talk about Jesus as fully divine and fully human? If you asked me to explain that, I would just nervously giggle and say, I'm not sure I can explain it. I can just say this is part of how the church has said God is revealed through Jesus, through his, not just his life and his deeds, but also through his suffering.
Yeah, to me, I just think there are a lot of mysteries that are in the Bible.
There are, yeah. And that line, my God, why have you forsaken me, is honestly one that I kind of stand back and just try to watch it without figuring it out. Doesn't mean we can't talk about it, but I mean, I find it, I don't know what that feels like for somebody to die like that. I just know I don't want that to be me. Do you know what I mean? That the idea of the psychological anguish that's part of that, for somebody like Jesus is stunning.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Kathleen.
I don't know if you had a chance to see David's message in chat about, but he raised a question that I've always wondered about. What if Jesus hadn't gone back to Jerusalem? Can we speculate on what would have happened?
Oh, yeah, I thought I got that one earlier. I think
Oh,
that,
I'm sorry. You know, I did have to take my dog out. So,
it might have been then. He probably would have been a little bit safer in Jerusalem, but you know, the Romans also had a good track record of sniffing out movements that they thought were dangerous and hunting down their leaders. We know from other ancient sources of other groups that got a little too popular and a little too uppity, and the Romans would find them. So Jesus probably knows, with his popularity, but also the way he's eager to tweak some of the religious authorities, but especially through, if he's talking about the kingdom of God, if he's talking about a different realm or a different nation or different society, those are really fighting words in the Roman Empire. Like the Romans, just as best we can tell, especially at this time in their history, were just not at all interested in any kind of political, what's the word I want? Dissent. Or people that are big, you know what I mean? So he probably knew his days were numbered throughout most of his life, but going to Jerusalem seems to probably have accelerated it.
so it wouldn't have mattered really where he was. I mean, we know he's living out what was anticipated and predicted, we now see, but it wouldn't have really mattered, practically speaking.
I think that's probably true. But going to Jerusalem, the way the Gospels describe what happens when he goes to Jerusalem, you know, he goes to the temple, he overturns tables. That's not a good thing to do if you want to keep a low profile. And then he spends all of his time teaching in the temple region, in the temple area, and the Gospels describe him as being really popular, and the crowds love him. And that's also, that can be really dangerous if it's Passover season, and it appears that's part of what it was. So a friend of mine, another New Testament scholar, likes to say that most neutral observers, if you were walking around Jerusalem that week, would have looked at Jesus and said, that guy's probably not going to last very long. That there's something about what he's doing that's would have been perceived as provocative. Which doesn't mean he's out to, like, I don't think it means he has a death wish necessarily, but he certainly seems to be planning some of his most visible and offensive statements for his time in Jerusalem. But yeah, Margaret.
I'd like to juxtaposition various parts of scripture with one another. And this Sunday we heard about the temptation in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And one of those temptations is throw yourself from the parapets and the angels will come and save you. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Is I put myself in danger and you didn't. And it to me is a kind of I began my ministry and I knew that I shouldn't tempt God, but here I am, and I ask on the mount, let this be taken from me. And here I am on the cross, and you're not saving me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, thanks for bringing up to in the prayer in the garden, right? Jesus says, "Let this cup pass from me." He's not eager for what's ahead. And that those dying words seem like a statement of disappointment in some way, that he feels betrayed. Yeah, I'm sorry.
From my New Testament, I use the Jewish annotated New Testament. I
Mhm.
love it. And in the introduction to Mark, this is a statement. Although Mark presents an earthly Jesus and not the heavenly mediator emphasized in Paul's letters, I think that's been clearly done in this story of the crucifixion. We see the agony and the hurt of a human being.
Yeah, I totally agree. I saw Carol Ann had her hand up, and then Ken, and then Dwayne, and then we'll go. Then I'll wrap this up. But yeah, Carol Ann.
Yeah, I don't know how well I'll articulate this, but I'm kind of playing with that question of how is this timeless, and that you introduced earlier. And I'm struck by the trial of our Minneapolis policeman, which we are going to be then revisiting the murder of George Floyd. And this was Passover. Here we are in Lent. We're walking in very vulnerable and delicate and potentially dangerous times. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for drawing that connection. I mean, it gets back to the ordinariness of Jesus' death. I don't mean ordinary, I mean like not mattering, but just the kind of thing that we see too often in society, right? This is the timelessness aspect of this. One of the things, and now jump to Ken and Dwayne, that I wanted to say as well, so much of Christian theology throughout 2,000 years has said, read these stories, read the passion narratives, and ask the question, what does the death of Jesus do for us? Like, what does it accomplish, right? Sins are forgiven, death is overcome. I mean, these are really good questions. I want to focus our question instead on what does the death of Jesus say about God, right? Where do we understand God at play in this, if at all? But also, what does it say about us? What does it say about humanity? Obviously, none of us were there. None of us, participated in this death. But how does Mark's telling of the story say something about human systems, or say something about suffering? Say something about our desire to protect our own privileges. What Mark's gospel says about God, perhaps also, is that this is the way in which Jesus dies, that there's no place, there's no human condition that God doesn't freely go into, that there's a kind of solidarity here that God takes on with every aspect of the human experience. Not just joy and grief, but here actually now pain, suffering, alienation, abandonment, that gets taken up into the life of God, so to speak, or that God experiences those things. God doesn't just put on a body and say, I wonder what it feels like to be human, but God actually enters into even those circumstances where humanity dishes out some of its worst upon our neighbor. So anyway, I promise I go to Ken next, and then Dwayne, and then Sue Ann, and then we'll.
I'll try to be brief. For me,
I always say that.
It's always been a question about timing. I mean, the covenant between God and Jesus, but the commentary in Gethsemane and also on the cross seems to suggest that Jesus doesn't feel like his ministry should end now. And maybe, comically, he's got these 12 disciples who don't have a clue what's going on. And he wants a little bit more time to do his work on earth before returning to the Father, in order to have a better opportunity for people to understand his teachings. So I don't see it as, why are you letting me suffer, as much as why is now the time for me to return, as opposed to I'm still a young man. Why can't I still spend a little bit more time and do the work a little longer?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. That's part of it too. I mean, again, this is why people talk about the mystery of the cross in a lot of ways, right? This is why our desire is to try to figure out what's going on here. And I'm not sure we always can penetrate those questions, but yeah, that's part of it, that he's engaged in some kind of an interior struggle that's really profound. Dwayne.
Because I do not yet accept the notion of the physical resurrection of Jesus, I think that his crucifixion is a story about how dangerous it is for anyone to speak against power and to proclaim the real love of God in the midst of difficult circumstances. And yet, I think it's especially about Oscar Romero. I've been to 3 of his memorial every 10 years, 2010, 1990, 2000, and 2010. People gather, they remember him, they treasure him, they recognize the courage that it took for any human being, such as Oscar Romero or for Jesus, to resist the pressures of the regime to proclaim. And that needs to be remembered, and their words are remembered, and they continue to inspire. So there's been resurrection in a spiritual sense within people who listen to those words.
Thank you. Sue Ann, were you going to say something?
Well, I'm reminded that Mark created this story because there was an audience he wanted to reach. And there was a movement. Jesus had led the movement. And now that Jesus was no longer there, the movement still had a lot of work to do. Quoting of Psalm 22, for example, there's so much in the Old Testament, in Torah, that tells us about the work that needed to be done. And so when I think about the description that Mark makes in that gospel, it's kind of like the Martin Luther King Jr. story. I know that there's still work to be done. This is the risk that we take by getting the work that God intends us to do. This is the upside, but this is the downside. So, if you believe that God is the supreme being, then this is what you have to be prepared to take on.
Thank you. So it's 8:15. I realized I've managed time terribly in terms of getting you to small groups like at 8 o'clock. But I'm okay with that if you all are. If people need to leave though, I totally understand that. These were the questions I was going to ask. I put them in the chat here. The first one is, are there some details that catch your attention that make you linger? The second one was, what do you make of the abandonment that looms so large in Mark's account of Jesus' death? Right, how is that? Why do you think it might be important that Jesus himself experiences abandonment from others? And then the third one is the question I asked just a couple minutes ago. What do you think this story from Mark might be telling us about God? What might it be telling us about ourselves or about human societies in general?
Matt, could you put the link in as well?
Sure, I'll put the link
Thank you.
in. If you want to find these same questions on a document online. I think there we go. I think what was I going to say? It's important to realize that the story, how about this? The story is really easy to tell if we make the chief priests and the high priests into these arch villains who, you know, wake up every morning and just want to, like, you know, you know, just hurt people, right? Or that, you know, these are people who like want to go out and, you know, torture small animals or things like that, right? It becomes easier to fathom the story if it's, well, Jesus was the nice person and the really cruel people didn't like him, and so they put him to death. But when we understand, I think that some of the leadership in this story are people who are religious folks, are people who are trying to uphold a religious system, and yet they're the ones who just simply can't find place for Jesus and his message in this. Mark's really clear that it's the leadership in Jerusalem in particular. Mark's not interested in trying to say this is the fault of everybody in Jerusalem or anything like that. Mark's really, I think, pretty consistently puts the blame on the leadership here. Just what does that mean then, that, you know, sometimes our best religious motives can be perverted, right? Or sometimes our best religious motives can leave us insensitive to the voice of God coming to us in a different way or through a different person. So I encourage you to think about that as well, right? That what if the leadership are the best of the best and not the worst of the worst? And how does that change the story for you? We've got like 13 minutes left. Do you want to go to small groups anyway with these questions?
I'm enjoying having the questions come to you and us all hearing them.
Oh, you just, yeah. Well, I like listening to myself talk. But that's not always the best use of everybody's time either, I recognize.
Matt, can I ask a clarifying question for what
Sure.
you just said? That Mark is really clear that leadership is at fault, but you're asking us to question if leadership is perceived as the best of the best, then I'm asking you.
Oh, yeah. Then the story hits a lot closer to home, I think, for me. That if the story is about cruel people who don't like nice people who do nice things, you know, that's great for the children's sermon, but it also lets me off the hook really easy and says, well, this is just because of a few bad apples out there. But if the story is about ways in which good motives get perverted, right, or our desire to uphold a religious system or a social system becomes so all-consuming that we're willing to treat others as expendable, right? That if from the perspective of the chief priests, the death of Jesus is warranted because it allows us to continue with what we're doing, right? Or we can treat his life as expendable because we have way more important fish to fry here, right? We've got a temple to keep up. We've got relationships with the Romans to manage. That makes the story more timeless to me, in that it makes me ask questions like, well, how do my own commitments or my own systems also make me numb to other people, right? Or who becomes expendable for my religious vision to continue? Does that make sense? It would be so easy if we could say, well, the chief priests were all corrupt. They were all collaborators with Rome. They were all just bad people, and they weren't even really religious. But there's no reason to believe any of that's true. What if these were really good people trying to do the right thing, and this is what they did? Is my question. But
yeah, that's a radical question.
Dwayne.
Well, that seems to take us back to that quote from the book, The Crucifixion. Who was the author?
Fleming Rutledge.
Yeah, that if that's what crucifixion was meant to be in Rome.
Uh-oh. I think you just went into a black hole, Dwayne. Your audio slowed down.
Here we're talking about
Sorry, I'm not hearing you, Dwayne. Are other people hearing?
No.
Oh, you're not
Wayne, you might.
hearing
You might turn off your video. It might help with the bandwidth.
Let me turn my video off.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
No?
Yes, I can.
Oh. I was saying the point, or what you're saying here takes us back to the Fleming quote that, but it thwarts it. If the crucifixion was meant to show that, or was meant for someone who was to be considered not a human, and we're saying here now we see Jesus as most human, maybe we are in an odd sort of reversal, parabolic way, seeing this through God's eyes, that this is what we're left with. So this is like God could go on without us, but won't. To redeem this is to bring this forward. That what the Romans intended crucifixion to mean does not determine God's meaning or Christ's death or even our own sense of who we are as humans being reduced here to really a non-species.
Right. Yeah, I like your way of putting that. I think that's part of what's going on in Mark, is that Mark is saying what looks like this utterly horrific, again, killing of somebody who the authorities thought was of no account, actually this is a person of great account. In fact, this is where you can find God. In fact, this is where you find God's Messiah, is precisely in this kind of horrific, garbage dump of a scene, of the worst that humanity can dish out upon itself. You know what I mean? That doesn't define him. At the same time, it does, right? He, in Paul's writings, Paul wants to keep his eyes on the cross and talk about Jesus as one who's crucified. In the Easter stories in Luke and in John, Jesus still has the wounds from crucifixion. You know what I mean? That it's not like crucifixion is something to get over or to steer around. It's like actually in this moment, God's going to redefine what human worth might look like. I think that's what I hear you saying, Dwayne, at least. Or
Yes,
at least
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Which gets to that question number 3. What might this story be telling us about God? Is that right? That God's way of breaking into the world or transforming the world isn't about meeting power with more power. It comes about through this way of becoming subject to it and of suffering violence. And I don't want to glorify the suffering of violence at all, but there's something about that's part of this story, because of the story is also, I think, about humanity's propensity to use violence to protect what we want or what we think is right, or to label some people as expendable for the sake of some greater good. I hope that resonates. Or you all think I'm a horrible person, perhaps, but that's how about this? I have a hard time reading. I read the news and I see this story played out. Anybody else? I might take a run at one of those 3 questions, since I figured if we went to small groups, we would perhaps just get not enough time for all of these, but I'll do better with time next week, I promise.
I really like this format, though.
Oh, thanks, Jane. Good. Any other details in Mark that caught your attention that you just think, what in the world is going on with that? Or
One of the things that intrigued me was that there's a lot more people involved in this than the story as you told it. All throughout the narrative, there's other people hanging around, and I get real curious in terms of who were they, what role were they playing, and maybe they're the ones who told the story of what happened. Um, our Sunday school version of this period is not all inclusive. And who are those other people?
Right. And who does the gospel author let you see? So that's, I've been saying we're going to look for the details in each one. Mark seems to want to make sure we see abandonment, but there are other people around, and other gospel authors will show us, from a different angle and let us see more.
I found it interesting, just curious about Judas throwing his money out and then the money actually going for a good purpose.
Which is actually in Matthew's, but we'll get to that. Yeah, that's a detail that we find in Matthew.
I'm reading it in Mark, I thought. In what you, or maybe
where he throws the money back. Yeah. Sorry, it's in Matthew 27. Sorry. Yeah, that's all right. We'll come to that next week.
Okay. I'll mention it then.
All right, please do. Yeah, Barbara.
Would you post your questions, your 3 questions, on the Westminster Adult Ed so that I could print them out?
Can I email them to you? Would that be easy? I don't have access to the website.
That would be wonderful.
Okay, if you email me, make sure I have your right email address, Jane, and I can do that tonight.
I will do that.
Thank you. You can just send it to me. Yeah, Barbara, were you?
Well, there were just 2 things, just ever so quickly. One was just the anointing of the oil, for Jesus, who rebukes riches and lavishness, was one. But the other that I don't think I've seen any other place was the young man in the linen cloth.
Yeah.
That was just really, I don't think I recall having read that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I skipped that detail, didn't I? Yeah, this is only in Mark, when at the arrest, we're told that a young man runs away naked, like runs out of his clothing, essentially, at the arrest. No other gospel includes that detail. Nobody quite knows what in the world's going on there. I think.
So curious.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Oh, I think it's underscoring the notion of shame and embarrassment, that it's, they've all gone to the garden, they've all supposed to be praying with him, they keep falling asleep. We had a sense that the disciples are just unable to do anything he wants them to do. And then here's this moment to stand with him, to show their courage. And one of them can't get out of there fast enough that, we assume somebody grabs his tunic and he just keeps running and just runs out of his clothes. That it seems to underscore that people will do anything they can to put distance between themselves and Jesus in his moment of need. That could be it. One scholar, I like this, has pointed out that the word for the linen cloth that he was wearing is the same word for the burial garments that in Mark 16, when they go to the tomb, they see the garments that he was embalmed or wrapped in lying there, and it's the same word. And so somebody has proposed that, somebody came to the Last Supper dressed up in a burial cloth as a way of showing, like, I'm all in, I'm 100% in, I'm willing to die for you, Jesus. And then, again, the irony of that person running out and leaving it behind.
My seminary education suggested that the young man in the linen cloth was actually Mark.
Some have proposed that this could be like, an Alfred Hitchcock kind of. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's 8:30. I love all the questions. This helps me think about next week about streamlining some things, but I don't want to make people stay on longer than they want to. I'm also happy to stick around if people have comments or questions or discussion. I have nowhere else to go, so there's a pandemic, but so people want to hang out longer, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, we'll be back next week. to look at Matthew's version,